Welcome to Chapter 5. We're going to be starting on the integumentary system. So the integumentary system is made up of skin and all the accessory organs of the skin. So this is going to include things like hair, nails, all of our glands like oil and sweat glands, and also the blood vessels, muscles, and nerves that are associated with the skin. Now, the integumentary system has 6 main functions. It protects the body from the external environment. So in other words, maintaining the integrity of the body, protecting it. It regulates body temperature. It converts vitamin D into its active form, which is calcitriol, and that will come up later. It also detects cutaneous sensations or sensory information coming into the skin. And it also helps to maintain homeostasis, things like storing blood, excreting and absorbing substances, that kind of thing. So the integumentary system has a role in homeostasis involved in all body systems, as we can see in this nice diagram. And we're going to see these diagrams a lot when we talk about individual body systems because we really want to focus on homeostasis and see the contributions of individual body systems and how they contribute to each individual system. So one of the major things that the integumentary system does is the keratinocytes, very specific cell in the skin that we will talk about yet, they help to convert or activate vitamin D into its active form calcitriol. And calcitriol is a hormone that's needed to aid in the absorption of calcium and phosphorus that you get from your diet. That calcium and phosphorus, once it's absorbed by the help of calcitriol, it's used in almost every system of your body. So in this diagram, we can kind of see how the integumentary system contributes to each other body system. So in the skeletal system here, we can see that calcitriol, that active form of vitamin D, helps to absorb calcium and phosphorus, which is needed to build and maintain bones. In the muscular system, we're also going to help absorb those calcium ions needed for muscle contraction. In the nervous system, we'll just go over a couple more of these here and then we will move on. But in the nervous system, those nerve endings in skin and the subcu tissue help to provide input to the brain for touch, pressure, thermal, and pain sensations. The integumentary system is also our first line of defense when it comes to immunity. So it provides that mechanical and also chemical barrier for anything coming in or wanting to cause harm to our body. Our skin is that first line of defense. The associated structures in the integumentary system are also big contributors of homeostasis in other systems. Like in the respiratory system, hairs in the nose are going to filter out dust particles from the air that you inhale. And that calcitriol is also going to have a big role in the digestive system and in the urinary system as well. So just a few points here, just looking at different systems and really connecting them all together when we're looking at homeostasis. So let's go into a bit more detail about the integumentary system. Remember, the skin and all associated structures. So there are 2 layers of the skin. The outermost layer, also known as the epidermis. Remember that epi, this prefix here, this means top. And then the second layer, or in-between layer, the inner layer, is called the dermis. Now, the dermis is where many of the accessory organs of the integumentary system lie. There is also a subcutaneous layer, a below the dermis layer. This is also called the hypodermis, and this lies below the dermis or just deep to the dermis. So this is actually just located deep to the skin, not included in the two layers of the skin. So here we have a nice sectional view of the skin and subcutaneous layer. We can see this epidermal layer at the top here, this much thicker dermal layer, and then at the bottom here, this subcutaneous layer. Now we can also see that most of our accessory organs are going to lie within the dermal layer. Sensory organs like the corpuscle of touch here, the Pacillian corpuscle, which is down here. These are sensory receptors within the dermis. We're also going to see hair follicles in the dermis too. You could see a hair follicle here and one here, where the hair follicle lies within the dermis, but the actual hair itself, the shaft, is going to come up through the epidermis into the exterior. Blood vessels as well are going to be within this dermal layer. We can see these blue and red blood vessels throughout the dermal layer here. But we don't have any blood vessels in this epidermal layer, as you can see. No blood vessels. We can also see nerves in this dermal layer as well. We can see them wrapping around the hair follicle here and kind of coming down through the subculaire, these yellow nerves. One other thing I want to note on this picture as well is that the subcutaneous layer consists of areolar and adipose tissue. So we can see this really fatty yellow globular tissue here that makes up the subcutaneous layer. So it's mostly going to be that areolar and adipose tissues. So let's talk about what makes up the epidermis. So in the epidermis, there are 4 major types of cells. About 90% of all the cells found within the epidermis are called keratinocytes. Keratino, this kind of prefix here, this means horns, or horn-like, I guess we could say. Horn-like. And you can kind of see, we can have a keratinocyte right here, top left. They're kind of spiky, kind of look like they have little horns all over them, kind of thing. So that's kind of where they get their name from. Now in the epidermis, the keratinocytes are arranged in usually 4 or 5 layers, and they produce the protein keratin. This is a protein. You can see that little protein keratin inside the keratinocyte there. Now keratin is a really tough and fibrous protein. And what keratin does is that it really helps to protect the skin and underlying tissues from things like abrasions, heat, microbes, and even chemicals. So keratin is going to be a very, very protective protein for our skin. Now about 8% of the epidermal cells are called melanocytes. So about 8% here are going to be melanocytes. Prefix melano means black. And the melanocytes here, these give skin its color. Next we have the intraepidermal macrophages. These are also called Langerhans cells. So I'll write this in here because this will come up later as well. We'll kind of see both of these terms used. And these are going to be cells that are involved in the initial immune response. These are going to be found in very small percentages in the epidermis compared to the keratinocytes and melanocytes. There's going to be very few intraepidermal macrophages. Then we have tactile epithelial cells. These are also called Merkel cells. These are going to be the least numerous of all the epidermal cells. And they are pretty cool because they detect touch. So they are a touch receptor. You can kind of see that they are very closely associated with the sensory neuron here. So they're going to send those detections of touch very quickly away from the skin surface so that you can perceive that touch. So we mostly covered keratinocytes. They produce keratin is the main thing that these cells do, and they're very, very numerous, pretty much what the majority of your skin is made up of. Let's go a little bit over melanocytes. Now, melanocytes produce the pigment melanin. Now, melanin is a yellow-red or a brown-black pigment that contributes to skin color, and it also absorbs UV light. Now there's this really cool thing, and this is how it actually protects your cells from UV damage. So DNA within the nucleus can be really damaged by UV light, but your skin has a method to really reduce that. So I'll draw a little picture here. So we have the keratinocytes here. And here I'm going to draw, this is going to be a melanocyte. Now melanocytes actually will have these long, slender projections that extend between the keratinocytes, and they will transfer melanin from the melanocytes to the keratinocytes. So here, for example, we'll say these little granules are going to be melanin, and so they're going to be going through these projections to the keratinocytes. So this blue one is the keratinocyte. So we have these melanin granules in the light blue going to the keratinocytes. Now, once in the keratinocytes, the melanin granules will cluster to form a protective wall over the nucleus. So say that this here is going to be the outside of the skin. Here we have the sun beating down with its UV rays. And we're going to have the nucleus here in the keratinocyte. And these granules will cluster kind of over the nucleus here, making this protective shield over the nucleus. Because remember that the nucleus, or the DNA within the nucleus, is very easily damaged by UV rays. So these melanin granules will cluster, creating this protective wall over the nucleus on the keratinocytes. And they're usually only going to cluster just on the side towards the skin surface. So they're usually not going to go over on this side, because this isn't going to be the side where the UV rays are coming in from. They're just going to cluster on the side where the UV rays are going to be coming in from. So in this way, they shield the nuclear DNA from the UV damage. So the interesting thing too is that even though the melanin granules will protect the keratinocytes, the melanocytes themselves are actually quite susceptible to UV light. They help to protect the keratinocytes, but they don't really protect themselves very much. So a really interesting way that the cells use melanin to protect the DNA within the keratinocytes nucleus. Okay, next we have these intraepidermal macrophages. Just very briefly, these come from red bone marrow, and they migrate to the epidermis, where again they contribute a very small portion of the epidermal cells. Like I said, the intraepidermal macrophages participate in the immune responses mounted against microbes that invade the skin. Now, these cells are actually very easily damaged by UV light. the melanocytes don't really protect these cells. But their role in the immune response is to help other cells to recognize invading microbes and to destroy them. So we will go over these cells a little bit more on our immune system chapter, but for right now, just a brief overview on these cells. And then lastly, these tactile epithelial cells. These are located in the deepest layer of the epidermis, and they contact the flattened processes of a sensory organ or a nerve cell like we saw in the last slide. And this is on a structure called a tactile disc or a Merkel disc. So we have these, again, just a quick picture here. We have these tactile cells, these Merkel cells, and they attach to this tactile disc or Merkel disc. So this is going to be this is the actual disc portion that is the end of a sensory neuron. So this is just a neuron, but the end of the neuron that's connected to the tactile epithelial cells is specifically called a tactile disc. And these tactile epithelial cells are going to be the cells that actually detect touch sensations. So we've gone over what cells make up the epidermis, but now we're going to talk about the different layers of the epidermis. So the skin is made up of several distinct layers of keratinocytes in various stages of development. Now, in most regions of the body, the epidermis have 4 strata. Strata is another word for layers. Now, these 4 strata that are found in most regions of the body are going to be the stratum basale. This is going to be the deepest layer. The stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, and the stratum corneum being the most superficial layer. Now, these 4 layers, this makes up the skin. Now, in areas where exposure to friction is very high, like in places like the fingertips, the palms, or the soles of the feet, the epidermis actually has 5 layers. So it has the deepest 3 layers, and then there's going to be another layer called the stratum lucidum. And then we have a thick stratum corneum in this thick skin as well. So thick skin is made up of the 5 layers with a thick stratum corneum, whereas thin skin, pretty much everywhere else on the body where you're not going to have high friction, this consists of just the stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and a thinner stratum corneum. So here we can see a pictorial representation of those layers of the epidermis. So on the left we have a kind of a cartoony picture, and on the right is an actual picture through a microscope. So let's go over each of these layers here. So first, the most basal layer is the stratum basale. This is composed of a single layer of cuboidal or columnar keratinocytes. So here we can see that blue basement membrane here separating the epidermis from the dermis. And we have this single layer of cuboidal or columnar keratinocytes here. So just one layer here. Now, some cells in this layer are going to be stem cells, and these are cells that undergo cell division continuously. So these are going to be cells that produce new keratinocytes. The cells in this layer contain keratin intermediate filaments. And the keratin intermediate filaments form the tough protein keratin in the more superficial epidermal layers. So it's kind of the pretense to keratin. Now the keratin that we're going to see more in these upper layers here, this is going to protect the deeper layers from injury. So this kind of the keratin, or the precursor to keratin, is going to start with the keratin intermediate filaments in the stratum basale layer, that single layer of stem cells. Now, just superficial to the stratum basale, we find the stratum spinosum. Now, spinos means thorn-like. So in this layer, we're going to have mostly a lot of keratinocytes. You can see these are labeled here. Kind of these thorn-like, spiky-looking keratinocytes arranged in maybe 8 to 10 layers. So it's a much thicker layer here. It's going to be starting from here and all the way down, touching that stratum basale. So this entire section is going to be that stratum spinosum. They're pretty globular, round looking through most of the layer, we can see here, but as we kind of get more superficial, they get a little bit flatter. You can see near the top portion. Now these cells are produced by the stem cells in the basal layer, and some of them still retain a bit of their ability to divide rapidly. The cells in this layer produce coarser bundles of keratin in intermediate filaments than in the basal layer. Now this arrangement of cells with their little spikes kind of connecting to one another, this adds a lot of strength and flexibility to the skin. Kind of like cogs in a machine kind of thing, that they lock together really well, but they can also move against one another. So it adds that strength and flexibility. Now about at the middle of the epidermis, we have the stratum granulosum. Oh, actually, sorry, before I go into stratum granulosum, I just want to talk about 2 more things in the stratum spinosum. In the stratum spinosum layer, we also have a couple other things. So we also have these intraepidermal macrophage cells in this layer. So we can see one of these big cells here. Remember, those are going to be those cells that are involved in the immune response. And in this layer, we also have projections of melanocytes. So we can see a melanocyte down here. It's just a slightly different color than the other cells in the stratum basale. And we can see these little projections here, kind of one going up there, one going here, here, and here. And remember, these are going to be the projections giving the melanin to the keratinocytes in order to protect those keratinocytes. So within that stratum spinosum, we're going to see those melanocyte projections as well. Okay, so then let's move on to the stratum granulosum. So this layer consists of about 3 to 5 layers of quite flattened keratinocytes. You can see here they're much flatter than in the more basal layers. And these cells are undergoing apoptosis. So remember, this is going to be programmed cell death. So in this layer, the organelles are starting to degrade as they move further from the source of nutrients. So remember, we have these nutrients down here coming from the blood vessels in the dermis. But because we don't have any blood vessels in the epidermis, as you get further away from the dermis, we're going to kind of lose connection with those nutrients and kind of gets harder and harder to survive. So what that means is that the cells in the stratum basale are going to have a lot of nutrients because you see they're right in here next to those blood vessels, but as we get further away it gets more and more difficult. So as we're kind of getting to that stratum granulosum layer, we're kind of too far away from the nutrients coming from the blood vessels that these cells are starting to undergo apoptosis. Now in this layer, the cells are no longer producing the keratin intermediate filaments, but because the cells are getting smaller, these filaments are more apparent. So we can see them more under the light microscope, so kind of staying a little bit darker. Now, a distinctive feature in the cells of this layer is the presence of these darkly staining granules of protein called keratinohyalin. And this assembles keratin intermediate filaments into keratin itself. Now, also present in the keratinocytes in the stratum granulosum are membrane-enclosed lamellar granules. This is going to be labeled right here. And these fuse with the plasma membrane and release a lipid-rich secretion. Now, this is released between the layers of the epidermis, and it really acts as a water repellent sealant. And it really helps to retard the loss and entry of water and foreign particles. So not only does it seal water from coming into your skin, but it also helps to seal water in, keep you hydrated, keep you from losing a lot of water. So these are going to release lipids acting as a water repellent. So since apoptosis also starts in this layer, the cells can no longer carry on metabolic activity. So this is kind of the layer, the stratum granulosum is going to be the layer that marks the transition between the deeper metabolically active strata and the dead cells in the more superficial strata. So this layer is kind of going to be the intermediate layer. They're starting to die, but they're not totally dead yet. Whereas down here, these are all going to be very metabolically active, still even dividing cells. And above it here are going to be dead cells. Okay, so we have two more layers to kind of discuss briefly. I'll erase a little bit of this here. Okay, next we have the stratum lucidum. Remember, this layer is only going to be present in thick skin, and it consists of about 4 to 6 layers of flattened, clear, dead keratinocytes. And these dead keratinocytes contain large amounts of keratin and very thickened plasma membranes. So this is going to be that layer that adds a lot of extra toughness. And that's why we're just going to see this on thick skin. Remember, areas that is going to be seeing a lot of extra friction, like your hands and your feet. Lastly is the stratum corneum. This is the most superficial layer of the epidermis, and it consists of, on average, about 25 to even 30 layers of these dead keratinocytes. In thick skin, though, the stratum corneum can be as thick as even 50 layers. Now these cells are going to be extremely thin. They no longer contain a nucleus or any internal organelles. And these cells overlap on one another quite a lot, kind of like scales on a snake. kind of thing. So you can see like one cell here. So they're kind of just overlapping, fitting in where they can. So here on the right, we can also see those layers that we just went over. So we have this stratum basale layer. I'll put it kind of in this. So we have that single layer of the columnar cuboidal cells kind of here. We have that stratum spinosum layer. So quite a thick layer here, kind of coming here and kind of going down here. So it's going to be like all this layer here. The stratum granulosum, this is going to be that darker layer here because of those lamellar granules. And there we have the stratum lucidum here, which is a clear layer, but on here is coming up just red from the stain of this particular microscope picture. And then the stratum corneum up top here with these really flattened, dead, very thin keratinocytes up here. Okay. Melanin is a class of compounds found in plants and animals, and it serves primarily as a pigment. So the class of pigments are derivatives of the amino acid tyrosine. The most common form of biological melanin is eumelanin. And eumelanin is a brown-black polymer. Now, another common form of melanin is pheomelanin. And pheomelanin is a red-brown polymer. And pheomelanin is largely responsible for things like red hair and freckles as well. Okay, so albinism, this is going to be an inherited disorder of melanocytes where the individual has a complete inability to produce melanin. Most albinos have melanocytes, but these melanocytes are going to be unable to produce or to synthesize tyrosinase. And so they're unable to produce melanin, the melanin protein itself. So because of this, melanin is missing from their hair, even their eyes and their skin. One other thing with albinism is that it results in problems with vision and also a tendency for the skin to burn very easily. Vitiligo is the partial or complete loss of melanocytes from patches of skin that produce irregular white spots. Now, the loss of melanocytes may be related to an immune system malfunction, and this is where the antibodies actually attack the melanocytes. Next, let's talk about the dermis. So we've pretty much talked extensively about the epidermis already. Now we're going to be moving on to the dermis, and this is the middle layer of the integumentary system. So the dermal layer is composed of dense irregular connective tissue that contains collagen and elastic fibers. Now it's really a woven network of fibers that has very great tensile strength. And what that means is that it resists pulling or stretching forces. It also has the ability to stretch and recoil very easily. The dermis is much thicker than the epidermis, though its thickness varies from region to region in the body. where we're going to see the greatest thicknesses in the regions of the palms and the soles. Pretty much where we have thick skin, the epidermal thick skin, we're also going to see very thick dermis in those areas as well. A few cells in the dermis, these are going to be predominantly fibroblasts. Well, the main cell in the dermis are going to be fibroblasts. There's going to be some macrophages and a few adipocytes. And these adipocytes are mainly going to be found near the boundary of the subcutaneous layer. Now, blood vessels, nerves, glands, and hair follicles, these are all going to be embedded in the dermal layer. Now, because of the blood vessel density, the dermis is essential for the survival of the epidermis. I'll say that again, the dermis is essential for the survival of the epidermis. Okay, now there are two regions of the dermis. We have a very thin papillary region. This makes up about 1/5 of the thickness of the total layer. We're going to see a lot of collagen and very fine elastic fibers in this layer. And then the other layer, or the other region of the dermis, is going to be the reticular region. And this is attached to the subcutaneous layer. Now, in the reticular region, this is where we're going to see bundles of thick collagen fibers, scattered fibroblasts, and various other kind of wandering cells like macrophages. So here we can see the dermal layer. The papillary region is going to be the most superficial region that is connected to the epidermis. And the papillary region's surface area is greatly increased by dermal papillae, these little bumps in the top of the dermis. They're kind of small, almost nipple-shaped structures. They project into the undersurface of the epidermis. Now, all dermal papillae also contain capillary loops. It's not labeled here, but this is what we're going to see right here and here and here. These are all capillary loops. These are going to be blood vessels that go into each dermal papilla. Some dermal papillae also contain corpuscles of touch. These are also called Meissner's corpuscles. These are going to be nerve endings that are sensitive to touch. There's even some other dermal papillae that contain free nerve endings. We can actually see one right here in this dermal papillae. This one here is a You can see that yellow nerve ending there that doesn't have a particular capsule or anything surrounding it. These free nerve endings essentially are just dendrites that lack any apparent structural specialization. So they are just kind of free little dendrite endings. The collagen fibers in the reticular region of the dermis, these are arranged in kind of like a regular net-like manner. So they're kind of arranged like a net, and this arrangement really helps the skin to resist stretching. Blood vessels, nerves, hair follicles, even oil glands and sweat glands, these are going to occupy the spaces between the collagen fibers within the dermis. So we can see these here, the hair follicles, sebaceous, these are going to be oil glands. We'll learn a little bit more about glands later, but sebaceous glands are oil glands. And then also these nerves, blood vessels, these are going to be between those collagen fibers in the dermis. Accessory organs to the skin, which are also part of the integumentary system, are hair, nails, and skin glands. These all have a really important function. For example, hair and nails work to protect the body, and sweat glands help to regulate body temperature. Now, hair is going to be present on most skin surfaces, except for the palms, the palmar surface of the fingers and soles, and also the plantar surfaces of the feet. Even though the protection that it offers is pretty limited, the hair on the head protects the scalp from injury and from the sun's rays. And it also helps to decrease heat loss from the scalp, for example, in winter. Each hair is composed of columns of dead keratinized epidermal cells that are bonded together by extracellular proteins. It's made up of the shaft and the root. Now the shaft is the superficial portion. It projects above the surface of the skin. Now the root is the portion of the hair that's deep to the shaft, and it penetrates the dermis and sometimes will go into the subcutaneous layer as well. Now the base of each hair follicle and its surrounding dermal root sheath is an onion-shaped structure called the bulb. Now this structure houses the papilla of the hair, which contains areolar connective tissue and many blood vessels that nourish the growing hair follicle. So that's all found within the bulb. You can see the blood vessels coming into the bulb here, as well as the papilla of the hair. So all works to nourish that growing hair follicle. Here we can see inside kind of that section of the root and the bulb here. So here is the entire bulb, and here we have the shaft up top. Now the root and the shaft both consist of 3 concentric layers. We have the medulla, which is that innermost kind of a yellowy layer here. Then we have the cortex, a little bit like a pinky color there, and then the cuticle of the hair. So these are going to be the 3 layers of the root and the shaft. The cuticle of the hair is this blue thinner layer here. Now the inner medulla, sometimes it's lacking in thinner hair. It's composed of 2 or 3 rows of irregularly shaped cells that contain large amounts of pigment granules in dark hair and small amount of pigment granules in gray hair, and they lack pigment in white hair. So the medulla is going to be kind of the pigment layer. The layer that gives hair its color. The middle cortex forms the major part of the shaft, and it consists of very elongated cells. Then the cuticle of the hair, which is the outermost or most superficial layer. This consists of a single layer of thin, flat cells that are very heavily keratinized. Now, surrounding the root of the hair is the hair follicle. Now, the hair follicle is made up of an external root sheath and an internal root sheath. And together, these are referred to as the epithelial root sheath. Then there's the dense dermis surrounding the hair follicle is called the dermal root sheath. So this all kind of works to protect that follicle. Here we can also see the papilla of the hair. And the papilla is really essential for hair growth in general, but really the follicle growing itself. So it plays a really important role in regulating the hair growth cycle. You can see the blood vessels are also coming here into the papilla of the hair as well. This is just a transverse section of the hair root showing us the concentric layers. Here we can see that internal medulla layer, then the cortex, and then the cuticle of the hair layer, that much thinner layer. And then we can also see the follicle being the epithelial root sheath made up of the internal root sheath, then the external root sheath, and then that dermal root sheath being the outermost layer there. Next, we are on to nails. Now, nails are going to be plates of tightly packed, hard, dead, keratinized epidermal cells that form a clear, solid covering of the dorsal surfaces of the distal portions of the digits. Now, each nail consists of a free edge, the nail body, and the nail root. Also, a couple of other terms in here too that we will go over, the lunula and the eponychium. First off, the nail body is going to be the visible portion of the nail. Below the nail body is a region of epithelium and a deeper layer of dermis. And most of the nail body appears pink, and this is because of the blood flowing through the capillaries in the underlying dermis. The free edge is going to be white, as we can see here, and as we know from most of us having longer nails. It's white because there are no underlying capillaries in this area. The nail root is going to be the portion of the nail that's buried in a fold of skin. The whitish crescent-shaped area of the proximal end of the nail body is called the lunula. Lunula means little moon. And it's white in color because the vascular tissue underneath it doesn't show through the really thick epithelium in the area. So beneath this free edge here is a thickened region of stratum corneum called the hyponychium. And the hyponychium secures the nail to the fingertip. So it's going to be a thickened region of stratum corneum. But its actual function is to secure the nail to the fingertip. Now, the epidermis of the nail bed actually lacks a stratum granulosum. The eponychium here, this is also called the cuticle. This is a narrow band of epidermis that extends from and adheres to the margin of the nail wall. Now, nails have a variety of functions. I'll put these down here. So the first function that nails have is that they protect the distal ends of the digits. So I'll put just protect distal digits. That's an important one there, because we do use our hands and our fingers to do a lot of things. Having that little bit of extra protection is important. The second function they have is that they provide support and counter pressure to the palmar surface of the fingers, and this is to enhance perception and enhance manipulation. So it's a counter pressure to kind of press against the opposite side when we're trying to pick something up. So support and counter pressure to the palmar surface of the fingers. This is to enhance touch perception and manipulation. So manipulation is just our ability to handle objects. Okay, the third and last function is that it allows us to grasp and manipulate small objects. And our nails can also be used to scratch and groom the body in various ways. So grasp and manipulate small objects. Think of like your pen or pencil. And also used to scratch and groom our bodies. So we are going to move on to glands in the skin. Now, several kinds of exocrine glands are associated with the skin. These include sebaceous glands, which are oil glands, sudoriferous glands, which are sweat glands, and ceruminous glands. I will note one thing, that mammary glands are actually a specialized sudoriferous gland that secrete milk. So these are going to be in here, this category. Okay, so first going over the sebaceous glands. So the secreting portion of sebaceous glands lies in the dermis and usually opens into the neck of a hair follicle. So we're going to see one actually right here. So this is going to be a gland, and it opens up here into the neck of a hair follicle there. Now, these types of glands are going to be absent in palms and soles. They're found in small quantities in most areas of the trunk and the limbs, and they're going to be found in the largest quantities in the skin of the breasts, the face, the neck, and also the superior neck, or superior chest, sorry. These glands will secrete an oily substance called sebum. And sebum is a mixture of triglycerides, cholesterol, proteins, and inorganic salts. Sorry, that's oil there. Okay. Next, we're going to go over the sudoriferous glands. Now, sudoriferous glands are sweat glands, and there are a lot, about 3 to 4 million in the body. And they release sweat or perspiration into hair follicles or skin through pores, so onto the skin surface. Now, they're divided into two different types. These are eccrine sweat glands and apocrine sweat glands. Equine sweat glands are the most numerous, and they are simple coiled tubular glands that are distributed on most areas of the body, except for a couple places like the lips, nail beds, toes, eardrums, and genitals. Here we have an eccrine sweat gland right here. You can see the secretory portion is located mainly in the deep dermis. You have an excretory duct that travels through the dermis, through the epidermis, and then ends at a pore on the surface of the skin. Now, sweat glands produce a secretion that consists mainly of water, but also contains small amounts of ions, urea, ammonia, glucose, and lactic acid. Now, the main function of sweat glands is to help to regulate body temperature through evaporation. As the sweat evaporates, large quantities of heat energy also leave the body surface. Now remember that the homeostatic regulation of body temperature is known as thermoregulation. Now, apocrine sweat glands are mainly found in the skin of the axilla, or the armpit, the groin, and also the areolae of the nipples, and also found in the bearded regions of adult males. So you're going to see an apocrine sweat gland right here. So the secretion of these glands is completed by exocytosis. It really contains, apocrine sweat contains the same components of eccrine sweat, plus some more lipids and proteins. So as you can see here, it's going to open to a pore on the hair shaft. Now, sweat secreted from apocrine sweat glands is odorless. However, when it interacts with bacteria on the surface of the skin, the bacteria is going to metabolize the components of apocrine sweat, causing it to have a musky odor that's often referred to as body odor. Body odor due to bacteria metabolizing that apocrine sweat. Okay, now the final type of skin gland is the ceruminous gland. These are modified sweat glands as well that are located in the external ear, in the ear canal. Now they produce a waxy lubricating secretion. The combined secretion of the ceruminous and sebaceous glands is a yellowish material called cerumen. We also know this as earwax. Now, cerumen is going to waterproof the ear canal, and it also prevents bacteria and fungi from entering the cells. Now, there are a couple different types of perspiration or sweating. Insensible perspiration, this is when essentially we can't perceive the sweat. So sweat essentially evaporates from the skin really quickly before we can even perceive it as moisture on our skin. The other way is by sensible perspiration. So this is where the sweat is excreted in much larger amounts so that we actually do perceive the moisture on our skin. And actually during thermoregulatory sweating, sweat first forms on the forehead and the scalp, and then extends to the rest of the body, forming last on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Now, we already kind of talked about the 4 different types of glands, where they're found and what they produce, but let's just really quickly just kind of get a visual on what each of these glands look like. So first off are sebaceous oil glands. These are going to be simple branched acinar. So they kind of are little light bulb shaped, but they have a couple branches to them. And then actually all other three, the eccrine sweat glands, apocrine sweat glands, and also the ceruminous glands, are all going to be simple coiled tubular glands. So we're going to move on to sensory receptors. We will cover sensory receptors in a little bit more detail when we cover somatic sensations, but we're going to briefly go over them now when we talk about the integument. So first off, we're going to look at where they are located specifically. So we will have superficially located sensory receptors and deep sensory receptors. So our superficially located sensory receptors are going to be found more in the middle to upper part of the dermis, whereas the deep sensory receptors are going to be found deep to all of them, kind of in the lower part of the dermis. So first off, we have these type 1 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. This is another name for those tactile discs that make contact with Merkel cells in the stratum basale. We have free nerve endings, are also another superficial sensory receptors. These are going to be dendrites that lack any apparent structural specialization. We have the corpuscles of touch. These are also called those Meissner's corpuscles, and they sense very fine or soft touch. They also detect pressure and slow vibration. Then we have type 2 mechanoreceptors. These are also called Ruffini's corpuscles, and they are sensitive to crude touch or also to stretching of the skin. And then the last superficial sensory receptor we have are the hair root plexuses. So these are going to be sensitive to crude touch that affect the hair. Then deep to all of those are the lamellated corpuscles. These are also called Pacinian corpuscles, and these sense deep pressure and fast vibration. So here on this diagram, we can see where those tactile discs and those tactile epithelial cells are. Remember, those are those Merkel cells. And we can see where they are in relation to the dermis and the epidermis here. So we have the dermis, remember, down here, and the epidermis on these upper layers. So what happens if the integument gets damaged? So this is when we're going to discuss wound healing. So skin damage really sets in motion a sequence of events that repairs the skin to its normal structure and function. Now there are two types of wound healing. The first one we'll discuss on this slide, which is epidermal wound healing. And then the other one we're going to discuss on the next slide, which is deep wound healing. So this epidermal wound healing is more superficial, whereas the deep wound healing, like the name implies, is a deeper wound. Now the edges of the epidermal wounds usually involve only slight damage to the superficial epidermal cells. Common types of epidermal wounds would include things like abrasions, this would be where a portion of the skin has been scraped away. Another type of epidermal wound healing would be a minor burn. So just examples of where we're going to see this type of wound healing. So here, this picture above, we can see what happens in epidermal wound healing. So in response to an epidermal injury, the basal cells of the epidermis surrounding the wound will actually break contact with the basement membrane. They're going to enlarge and migrate across the wound. So we can see these cells here actually, these basal cells here, at the edges of the wound where they are detaching from the basement membrane, enlarging, and migrating across the wound here. Now they appear to migrate as a sheet along the basement membrane until the advancing cells from the opposite sides of the wound meet. So until they kind of touch in the center and meet together. Now, when they encounter one another, they stop migrating due to a cellular response called contact inhibition. So that's a cellular response that causes them to stop moving once they come into contact with one another. Now, as these basal epidermal cells migrate, a hormone called the epidermal growth factor stimulates basal cells or basal stem cells to divide, and it causes them to replace the ones that migrated into the wound. So you can see these cells here that are dividing and replacing these cells here. So these cells are going to move and move, and we kind of need extra cells to fill in those gaps once they move. So again, this hormone is called the epidermal growth factor. That is going to be the hormone that stimulates these basal stem cells to divide and replace the cells that migrate into the wound. So that is pretty much the entire process of epidermal wound healing. Then these cells are just going to continue to divide and replace those cells more superficially. Deep wound healing, on the other hand, occurs when the wound is obviously much deeper, and the healing process is much more complex. So more cells are going to have to migrate and proliferate or divide in the area of the wound. There's going to be a lot more work of fibroblasts to migrate along fibrin threads, and they also synthesize scar tissue, which is made up of collagen fibers and glycoproteins. So we have the collagen fibers here, and then a lot of glycoproteins come from these fibroblasts. Now, deep wound healing is going to start with an inflammatory phase, which opens up blood vessels to allow immune cells into the wound. And this is really to keep bacteria and microbes from entering deeper into the body. And deep wound healing is going to end with a maturation phase. And this is the phase where the scab is formed. So deep wound healing actually consists of 4 different steps. We have step 1 is the inflammatory phase, step 2, the migratory phase, step 3, the proliferative phase, and step 4 is the maturation phase. In the inflammatory phase, a blood clot forms, and it will loosely unite the edges of the wound. So as this name implies, this step involves a lot of inflammation. So inflammation is going to be a vascular and cellular response. And this is going to help to eliminate microbes, foreign material, and dying tissue in preparation for repair. In this phase, we're going to get a lot of vasodilation. And this will also increase the permeability of blood vessels that are associated with inflammation, which is really going to enhance the delivery of helpful cells. So if we dilate or increase the diameter of blood vessels and increase that permeability of the blood vessels, This will allow helpful cells like phagocytic white blood cells called neutrophils and monocytes to go into the wound and essentially eat up a lot of this dead tissue, eat any bacteria that have come into the wound, and eat any microbes that could be potentially harmful. So this phase is going to allow in white blood cells like neutrophils and monocytes. Monocytes actually will develop into macrophages. That really good cleaning up cell engulfs and eats a lot of debris, dead cells, bacteria, that kind of stuff. Now the 3 phases that follow pretty much do all the work of repairing the wound. So in the migratory phase, this is where the blood clot becomes a scab. And the epithelial cells beneath the scab will migrate to reach each other to kind of bridge the gap in the wound. Then the proliferative phase is characterized by really extensive growth of epithelial cells beneath that scab and also continued growth of blood vessels. So we're going to get growth of epithelial cells. Again, these are epithelial cells beneath that scab, so the scab essentially is protecting that big gap of wound so that we can have a lot of repair, a lot of cells being made and bridging that gap. So that scab is protecting that wound. And then we're also going to get growth of new blood vessels in the proliferative phase as well. Then the maturation phase, this is where the scab comes off and the epidermis has been restored to normal thickness. Epidermis is the normal thickness. So this is where the collagen fibers are all more organized by this point. The fibroblasts decrease in number and the blood vessels are really pretty much restored back to normal. So this is just kind of like a finishing off phase to get everything back to normal.